Have you ever reached out to grab a door frame when nothing was actually wrong? Just a reflex your body fired before your brain could explain why? Have you ever stood in the middle of a grocery store aisle and felt your body shift to one side as though the floor had moved, except the floor had not moved? Have you ever caught yourself hesitating before stepping off a curb, not because you were being careful, but because something inside you sent a quiet signal that you needed an extra moment to calculate that drop? If you recognized yourself in any of those descriptions, I am asking you to stay with me through this entire video, because what I am about to explain is not something you will hear in a standard 15-minute clinical appointment, and it is not something that gets covered in the average conversation about healthy aging. And the reason it matters is not abstract or theoretical. It is the difference between identifying a correctable physiological problem early and spending years chasing symptoms that never resolve because no one has ever pointed the investigation in the right direction. The response most people get when they bring these complaints to a medical setting goes something like this. You are told to be careful on stairs. You are told to consider a cane. You are handed a referral to physical therapy where someone works on your ankle strength and your hip stability, and after 12 sessions, nothing fundamental has shifted, and you go home with a home exercise program you do for 3 weeks before it quietly disappears into a drawer. And what I want you to understand is that this outcome is not inevitable. It is the predictable result of treating a downstream symptom without identifying the upstream cause. The upstream cause, in the overwhelming majority of the cases I see in my practice, is not in your legs, not in your ankles, not even in your inner ear, though the inner ear is getting warmer. The real source of the disruption is the blood supply reaching the part of your brain that runs your entire balance system. My name is DoctorLeana, and I have worked in functional neurology and cervical spine rehabilitation for more than 2 decades. And what I am going to share with you today is the clinical model that consistently explains why people lose reliable balance, why that loss accelerates in ways that seem disconnected from any single cause, and what you can do about it starting tonight. Let me begin with a comparison that I think will stay with you. Imagine 3 people who all share one obvious thing in common, which is that none of them can walk in a straight line. The first is a fighter pilot who has just stepped out of a centrifuge after a high-G training simulation. The second is a woman in her 70s leaving a Thanksgiving dinner where she had 2 glasses of wine and a long nap on the couch. The third is a 58-year-old accountant from outside of Phoenix who has not had a drink in 11 years, slept well last night, and has no idea why he keeps veering to the right every time he crosses the parking lot at work. Same observable behavior, 3 completely different causes, 3 completely different solutions. The danger is treating all 3 identically because they look the same from the outside, and this is exactly what happens in clinical settings that are organized around managing symptoms rather than identifying mechanisms. The accountant in that example is not going to be helped by the exercises designed for the pilot or the protocols designed for the woman at dinner. He needs a different investigation entirely. So here is where I want to start that investigation with you. Balance is not a simple function. It is not something your legs do or something your inner ear handles on its own. Balance is the real-time product of 3 separate sensory systems working in precise coordination, feeding data simultaneously into a central processing structure. And that structure is issuing corrections so rapidly that none of it ever reaches conscious awareness unless something goes wrong. The 3 input streams are your visual system, which gives you the horizon and spatial reference points, your vestibular system, which is the fluid-filled apparatus in your inner ear that detects motion and gravitational pull, and your proprioceptive system, which is the continuous feedback your joints and muscles send upward to report on body position and ground contact. All 3 of these streams converge inside a structure at the base and rear of your skull called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is smaller than you might imagine if you have never seen a brain diagram. It sits behind and below the cerebral cortex, and it accounts for only about 10% of the brain's total volume. But here is the remarkable and clinically significant part. It contains more individual neurons than the entire rest of the brain combined. That density reflects the computational complexity of what it is doing every moment you are upright. It is not thinking in the way we usually mean that word. It is calculating, correcting, predicting, adjusting, doing real-time mechanical mathematics at a speed that no conscious process could match. And it is doing all of that continuously, invisibly, without your permission or participation. When the cerebellum is working at full capacity, you move through your day without any awareness of it at all. When it begins operating at reduced capacity, your body starts producing symptoms, and those symptoms are typically noticed long before anyone correctly identifies their source. I need you to understand one number because it reframes everything else I am going to tell you. Your brain represents roughly 2% of your body's total mass. 2%. And yet it consumes somewhere between 20 and 25% of all the oxygen your lungs bring in. It is extraordinarily energy intensive, extraordinarily sensitive to any reduction in blood delivery, and the cerebellum in particular is vulnerable because of a specific anatomical arrangement that creates a kind of structural fragility you will not find anywhere else in your circulatory system. The blood supply to your cerebellum does not travel a clean, unobstructed path. It arrives through two arteries called the vertebral arteries, and these arteries do something that is unlike almost any other major vessel in the body. Rather than traveling alongside the spine through soft tissue, they travel directly through it. Each of the cervical vertebrae, the 7 bones that make up your neck, has a small bony canal on each side called the foramen transversarium. And the vertebral arteries thread upward through these canals, one vertebra at a time, like a cord running through a series of tight rings, all the way up to the base of the skull. At the top, they wrap around the first cervical vertebra, the one your skull literally rests on, and enter the cranial cavity. Once inside, the 2 vertebral arteries join into a single trunk called the basilar artery, and the basilar artery is the primary blood supply for the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the entire posterior brain region responsible for coordination, timing, spatial processing, and balance integration. This is the vertebrobasilar circulation, and it is the most mechanically exposed major circulation in the human body because it is threaded through a column of bone and cartilage and muscle that is under constant mechanical stress. Think carefully about the implications. The artery feeding your balance center is running through your neck bones. If those bones are even fractionally misaligned, if the muscles around them are chronically contracted from years of looking at a screen with your head pushed slightly forward, if you have an old, unresolved soft tissue injury from a fender bender 15 years ago that was never properly rehabilitated, that artery is being compressed. Not catastrophically, not in a way that causes an emergency, but consistently across months and years in a way that gradually reduces the volume of blood reaching the cerebellum. And a cerebellum that is receiving 90% of the blood it needs is not a cerebellum that fails completely. It is a cerebellum that begins producing subtle, progressive errors, errors you experience as the slow accumulation of instability, the drift, the hesitation, the grab for the countertop, the slight unease about walking across an unfamiliar surface in the dark. Now I want to tell you about a patient I will call Margaret. She came to my clinic 14 months ago. She was 61 years old, a former middle school science teacher, precise and observant by nature, the kind of person who kept detailed notes about her own symptoms for 6 months before making an appointment because she wanted to have something useful to report. She had been drifting to the right when she walked, consistently and predictably, on flat surfaces, in familiar environments, with no explanation she could identify. Her neurologist had ordered imaging, found nothing acute, and told her the scan was reassuring. What came out in my intake with Margaret, when I asked about other changes she had noticed in the past year and a half, was a pattern I recognized immediately. She had been losing words in the middle of sentences, specifically proper nouns, the names of students she had taught for years, the names of restaurants she had been to dozens of times. She had been hitting a cognitive wall every day around 2:30 in the afternoon, a heaviness and slowness that was different from ordinary tiredness and that no amount of additional sleep seemed to resolve. And she had quietly stopped offering to drive at night because something about tracking fast-moving lights and managing multiple objects in her visual field had become subtly harder than it used to be. She had mentioned none of this to her neurologist because she did not think it was connected to the walking. It was all connected to the walking. What the imaging had missed was not a lesion or a tumor or a discrete pathology. It was a chronic mechanical restriction at the upper cervical spine that was compressing her vertebral arteries and reducing the blood flow reaching her cerebellum and posterior brain by a meaningful margin every single day. We addressed that restriction over the course of 10 weeks using the same approach I am going to walk you through today. At the 8-week mark, Margaret told me the rightward drift had stopped. At 12 weeks, she told me her word retrieval had measurably improved and that the afternoon wall had shifted from 2:30 to closer to 5. She also told me something that has stuck with me since. She said it felt like she had been watching her own life through slightly smeared glass for the past 2 years without realizing it, and that clarity had quietly come back. That is a description of restored posterior cerebral blood flow from someone who lived the experience. What I want to do now is walk you through 2 categories of intervention. The first addresses the mechanical restriction in the cervical spine that is creating the arterial compression. The second directly trains the cerebellum through coordinated challenges that build new neural pathways. Both are necessary. Neither one alone produces the outcome that both together can produce. Before I describe the mechanics, I want to identify 2 specific regions in the neck that matter most for vertebrobasilar circulation. Because most people who try to address neck tension on their own focus on exactly the wrong area. The most mobile segment of your cervical spine is in the middle, around the 4th, 5th, and 6th vertebrae. That is where you feel the stretch when you drop your chin to your chest or pull your ear toward your shoulder. That is also the area that is already moving too much in most people who spend time at a desk, and adding more mobility to an already hypermobile segment is not helpful. The restrictions that actually compromise vertebral artery flow are in 2 specific zones. The first is the cervicothoracic junction, the transition where your neck meets your upper back. This is where postural compensation accumulates over decades, where the forward head posture that comes from screen time and driving forces a rounding and stiffening that directly affects the artery path running through that region. The second is the upper cervical spine, specifically the 1st and 2nd vertebrae, C1 and C2, where the vertebral arteries make their final wrap before entering the skull. This is where compression has the most direct and immediate effect on posterior brain circulation. For the mechanical release work, begin by locating the prominence at the base of your neck, the spinous process of the 7th cervical vertebra, which protrudes noticeably when you flex your chin toward your chest. Place 2 fingers against the right side of that bony landmark. Now, rotate your head slowly to the right, and as you do, apply gentle but firm pressure with your fingers in the direction of the rotation, as though you are assisting the vertebra through its range of motion. You will feel a point of resistance, a taut elastic quality that tells you the joint has reached its end range. That is your stopping point. Hold there for 3 to 4 seconds before returning. As you return to neutral, maintain the fingertip pressure for 2 additional seconds before releasing. Repeat on the left side, then move your fingers 1 level lower and repeat the entire sequence. This sustained end range mobilization is how you create lasting change in joint capsule mobility, and it is specifically effective in the cervicothoracic junction where the real restriction lives. The second mechanical component addresses the large diagonal muscle on either side of your neck, the sternocleidomastoid, which runs from behind your ear down to your collarbone. When this muscle is in chronic contraction, which it is in most adults who spend significant time looking at a screen, it generates sustained lateral compression on the cervical structures, including the vertebral artery pathway. To release it, place one hand flat on your collarbone and press firmly downward to anchor the lower attachment. Now, slowly tilt your head away from that side and lift your chin upward and slightly to the opposite side. You will feel a clear, deep stretch along the lateral neck. Hold for 25 seconds, breathe steadily, and return slowly. Then, work 2 full minutes of firm circular massage along both sides of the cervical spine, from the base of the skull downward, with deliberate pressure designed to release the muscular tension that is contributing to arterial compression. Now for the cerebellar training, and I want you to understand why this matters before you do it. The cerebellum operates through a principle that neuroscientists call prediction error. It constantly generates a model of what your body is about to do, compares that prediction to what actually happens, and uses the gap between prediction and reality to refine its model. When you perform a movement that slightly exceeds the current accuracy of that model, the cerebellum is forced to update its wiring. That is neuroplasticity in its most targeted and practical form, and the cerebellum is unusually responsive to it. The first cerebellar training exercise asks you to stand with your feet at shoulder width and begin moving your hips in a slow, deliberate circle as though you are using a hula hoop in slow motion. As your hips rotate, allow one leg to step outward in a pattern that follows the hip movement. While both of those things are happening, begin alternating light taps with your right and left hands in a rhythm that is entirely independent of what your lower body is doing. You now have 3 movement systems operating simultaneously on different timing sequences, and the awkwardness you will feel in the first few attempts is not a sign of failure. It is the exact sensation of your cerebellum operating at the edge of its current neural map. Each session you practice this, that edge extends. Most people notice a clear smoothing within 5 to 7 days of daily practice, and that smoothing is a measurable structural change in cerebellar neural density. The second exercise comes directly out of vestibular rehabilitation and classical dance training, both of which arrived independently at the same technique for managing rotational disorientation. Stand facing a wall and fix your gaze on a specific point at eye level, a light switch, a mark, anything stationary and precise. Take 3 steps and execute a complete 360-degree turn. The key instruction is this. As you rotate, keep your eyes locked on that fixed point for as long as physically possible. And the instant the turn pulls your gaze away, complete the rotation and find that point again immediately. This trains the coordination between your vestibular system and your visual system during exactly the type of rotational input that most destabilizes people with compromised posterior circulation. The cerebellum learns to resolve the conflicting sensory data faster and more accurately with each repetition, and that resolution is precisely the capacity that erodes when vertebrobasilar flow is chronically reduced. I want to close with something that I think is worth saying directly. The standard framing for balance problems in older adults is that decline is a normal part of aging, and management is the appropriate goal. I disagree with that framing in the majority of cases I see, and I disagree with it based on what I watch happen when people understand the actual mechanism and intervene at the right level. The cervical spine restriction that compresses the vertebral arteries is a mechanical problem. Mechanical problems respond to mechanical solutions. The cerebellar underperformance that results from reduced blood flow is a training problem. Training problems respond to consistent, targeted, progressive challenge. Neither of these is mysterious. Neither requires a prescription or a procedure. What they require is an accurate model of what is actually happening, which is what I have tried to give you today. If you have been told that what you are experiencing is simply what getting older feels like, I want you to hold that conclusion a little more loosely. The body's capacity for self-correction when given the right input is significantly greater than most people are ever told. These exercises, practiced every single day without exception, not 3 times a week, not when you remember, every day, represent that right input for the specific system that is producing your symptoms. I want to hear what you are experiencing. Leave your age in the comments below and tell me which symptom you recognized first. I read every comment personally, and that information shapes the content I build for this channel. If this gave you a framework that changes how you think about what your body has been communicating, subscribe now and hit the like button. Every person who finds this channel and stays is someone we may be reaching before this becomes something harder to address. I am DoctorLeana. The system is not broken beyond repair. It is waiting for the right signal. Give it that signal, stay consistent, and I will see you in the next video.